Madam Chairwoman, I would like first of all apologize myself for not speaking French, but in fact I didn't know that it will be a conference mainly in French. The language is beautiful, but it is one of my weaknesses, not the only one. I have to say that I'm also not a historian, and the conference is mainly addressed to the history. However, since I was invited to speak about Yalta, I would like to say that my intention is not so much to discuss the history, but the meaning of Yalta conference as a kind of the institution which is a synonym of many negative elements in international relations. And I would like to say that it is important, especially that the world is at the moment in search of a new order without having a kind of the clear concept of a new one. The old one, known as bipolarity, was deeply rooted in the decisions which were taken at the conferences of the Second World War, and one of them was Yalta. I would like to say that some politicians and experts, they seems to me that they manifest a kind of the nostalgia for bipolarity, which was exactly deep-rooted in the decisions of Yalta and Potsdam, and before in Tehran conference. My fundamental question is, what would happen in Europe without Yalta? And I would like to say that the first reflection of a general nature is that the conferences, meetings of international relations, which are considered as a kind of the constitutive elements, that they are shaping the new reality. It is a mistake, because the reality is reflected by the meetings, conferences, and the documents. The international system was for the first time in the modern history shaped by the decisions taken within the Peace of Westphalia after 1648 as the end of the religious wars in Europe. And since then, all the systems which were known, including the system after Vienna Congress in 1814 and 15, the Berlin Congress in 1878 after the Balkan Wars, the Versailles system after the First World War, Yalta-Potsdam system after the Second World War, all of them were imposed by the victorious powers, and those who were losers accepted without saying the unconditional surrender, and the rules, norms, and principles were imposed by those who were winners in the war. Since the Second World War, 70 years after, for the first time, Europe does not have a great war, and the system as it is now is exhausted. And many people are considering that something is lost forever, but the new elements are unknown, and the situation is perceived as a kind of the chaos and disorder, which has to be replaced by a new order. It is not my intention here to speak about this new order, but to discuss, I would say, to what extent what happened in Yalta influenced our thinking about the European and global order addressed to the future. I would like to start by referring to an essay, article which was written by Zbigniew Brzeziński 30 years ago in February 1985 in Foreign Affairs. His essay was under the title "The Future of Yalta." And Brzeziński wrote, it has a Yalta, the first sentence, the first phrase of this essay was, Yalta is unfinished business. It has a longer past and it may have a more ominous future than is generally recognized, noted Brzeziński 30 years ago. He was right then, and he is right now, saying that much of our current preoccupation with Yalta focuses on its myth rather than on its continuing historical significance. An outline of the post-war European and global order was agreed upon not in Yalta, but in fact in Tehran. I would say that even before Tehran, as you remember, it was the Tehran conference was by the end of November, beginning of December 1943. In other words, more than 1 year before Yalta. And a lot of things happened between Tehran and Yalta. Specific decisions addressed to Poland were taken in 1944. I have in mind the set of agreed documents of the 22nd July, an establishment of the Polish Committee of National Liberation. This committee was invented and imposed by Stalin. And as the result, the new subordinated to Russia regime imposed in Poland also defined the new borders. And it happened in agreements of 27th July and 16th August 44. What is interesting, that these two agreements were considered as secret, and they were secret. In fact, for the first time, they were published by Russians in 1967. And I raised the question for myself why they were secret, because in fact, for Russia's propaganda, it would be very helpful to inform the Polish public opinion that Russia decided about the new borders, not only on the eastern borders, but also the western. They were very precisely defined, described, and Stalin, Soviet Union, promised in both these agreements to defend, I would say, this line on the future conferences, and eventually it happened. And my conclusion is that secrecy was justified for the reason that the line, both the so-called Curzon line and the line of Oder-Neisse border with Germany, were not agreed upon with the Western powers, neither with the United Kingdom nor with the United States. In other words, the most important elements happened in 44 before Yalta. Now I would like to say that I have here before me a quotation from the report which was written by the British politician to Churchill. But the main message, what I would like to share with you, is that Stalin correctly saw in the territorial disputes the opportunity to transform Polish independence into dependence on Moscow. So did the Poles. And prior to the Tehran meeting, the Polish Prime Minister desperately warned Churchill, as recorded by Sir William Strang on September 9, 1943, that I'm quoting, what was at stake between Poland and Russia was not merely a question of frontiers, but a question of general relations, and indeed the question of the survival of Poland as an independent state. A month later, Foreign Minister Anthony Eden reported to the British War Cabinet that the Polish Prime Minister had told him on October 6, I'm quoting, the general attitude of Stalin towards Poland, towards Germany and the Free German movement, and towards question touching other occupied countries, as well as his record and his whole mentality, implied more extensive ambitions than ambitions only in the eastern provinces of Poland, which were strategically important to Poland, but in no sense vital to Russia. Finally, on the eve of the Tehran meeting, Eden briefed the War Cabinet on November 22nd that the Poles feared, I'm quoting, that Russia's long-term aim is to set up a puppet government in Warsaw and turn Poland into a Soviet republic. And in fact, I would say these two elements, the governance, future governance in Poland, Polish political system and borders were not only interconnected and interdependent, but the borders were seen as a kind of the instrument for Stalin to install the communist regime in Poland, and it happened. I would like to say that all that, I would like to repeat once again, all that happened before Yalta. The result was that the follow-up reflected a new reality. And this new reality was also seen by withdrawal of recognition of an exiled Polish government. But the most important was subordination of Poland to Stalin personally in his personal decisions. In other words, Stalin issued the secret document that the full administrative and political control is up to him. In other words, all the documents, legal norms, etc., all that was considered as a kind of the facade. Decision was in Stalin's head as the head of the Soviet state and the head of the Red Army. All these and many other documents are well known and interpreted by many historians, and I would like to say that as far as myself, I do consider it as the best publication in this respect, the book which was published by Jan Karski about the policy of great powers towards Poland between 1918 up to 45. And this part of the Second World War should be recommended as really not only well documented, but written by somebody who participated actively in the period of the war. By the way, I would like to say that some years ago, in 2008, having in mind, I would say, the very sensitive and difficult relation between Poland and Russia, the decision of two governments was to establish a group, Polish-Russian group on difficult matters, with an intention to discuss all historical problems which are vulnerable, sensitive, with an intention to clear them up and not to make them a problem of political debate between Polish and Russian government. And the group was established by both countries with an invitation, the most competent and bright people. Two of them are here in front of me. It is Professor Nariński and Professor Paczkowski. But they were more or less 15 scholars on Polish side and 15 on the Russian side. The result was a volume published in 2010, the volume about more than 1,000 pages, where 15 blocks, the most sensitive issues, were interpreted by Polish and by Russian researchers and scholars independently. In other words, each chapter was in a mirror reflection. For example, such delicate issues like Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Katyń, execution of the Polish officer, massacre of the Polish officers in Katyń, and many other issues. And what is interesting that in this group, we are able, more or less in 2 years, to first of all, to select the facts and data which are not questionable, but interpretations are different, because the perception of the nations is different. And I would like to say that in the international politics and in both in bilateral and multilateral relations, the question of perception is very often much more significant than reality. Real facts are as they are described in hundreds of different publications, documentations, archives, documents, etc. But it is a question why interpretation is different. And here is, I would say, a problem of different mentality, psychology, but also not as the last factor, it is national interest. That history is very often considered as a kind of the instrument of current politics. And I would like to say that one should make a distinction between that what is the genuine history and that what is politicization. In Poland, it is very popular expression, historical policy or historical politics. And I would like to say that, in my view, policy, by the definition, is oriented to the future, and history should describe the past. And when somebody is speaking about the historical policy, it means that it is very close to the manipulation of history, instrumentalization of history. And Yalta is one of such a very typical examples. But I will come to that point. My intention is to give you the second message, namely that with Yalta or without Yalta, the fate of Poland was determined not through talks and negotiations, but by presence of the Red Army on the Polish territory and the new might of Stalin's Russia. Stalin imposed the system and Stalin defined the borders, both on the eastern part of Poland and on the western part of Poland. By the way, I would like to say that in my view, however, Yalta conference was mainly overtaken by the quarrels around the Polish question or future of Poland, but in fact it was not the main issue. The main issue was about Germany. What kind of Germany in the future, both for the Western powers and for the Soviet Union. Germany was a key element of the future order in Europe. All the treaties and agreements are interpreted in different forms and ways. As a rule, for lawyers, decisive is the text. For historians, quite often not only the text, but the context. For politicians, subtext, in other words, implied meaning of the text. Quite often, the commentators and observers consider the notion of Yalta as a pretext. In Poland, Yalta is a synonym of betrayal by Western allies. Poland was sellout. This is, I would say, the common understanding, for good reasons. The Munich conference is, for example, a synonym of appeasement policy, and Yalta of treacherous policy. What is ignored? Yalta reflected, as I said, the new reality, the situation on the battlefields. The future of Poland was not among the main goals of the Western powers. For Great Troika, the central issue was how to establish a new world order. Partition of Europe and partition of Germany was part of the broader new international landscape. Poland was considered as a part of the Russian domination in Central and Eastern Europe. The details were less important, but the main strategy was, as I would like to repeat it once again, decided before unilaterally by the Soviet Union. The lesson of Yalta, to what extent the pattern of Yalta is seen by global powers a model for the future. And this was, by the way, the subject of very interesting deliberations presented by Zbigniew Brzeziński in his essay. At the moment, in many parts of Europe, in many countries, people are discussing a model of 21st century concert of powers. And this concert of powers is based on the notion that it is once again a troika. The United States, European Union, and Russian Federation. For the transatlantic era, I would like to say that this concert of powers is very anachronic, because the notion of concert of powers is taken from the Metternich concept of the 19th century. In Russia, it is a great nostalgia to re-establish, I would say, this type of organization of the world. And it doesn't matter what kind of form, but it has to be decided by great powers. And I would like to say that great powers, it means not only the might, potentials, interest, power, but it means also great responsibility. And it seems to me that great powers quite often, they neglect, I would say, this element of responsibility. Not all of them, some of them, not always, but very often. Some researchers and theorists initiated recently debate about the new world order based on a modern concert of powers, design marked by strong norms and efficient procedures. And they have in mind a kind of institutionalized mode of operation. I have in mind, for example, consultations, confidence building measures, and the formal and informal but systemic and methodical preparation of decisions in establishing multilateral bodies. And I would like to say that such an approach is naive, not to say infantile, but quite popular among researchers. Because people who are dealing with concepts, they have an intention to produce something what will be logical, consistent, and very elegant in presentation. The problem is that international relations are not always consistent, not logical, and not elegant at all. In other words, it has to be the point of departure in thinking about a new order should be reality. And this reality is based on three very fundamental factors. One of them is power, second is interest, and the third one is values. For non-democratic countries, values do not play a role. They do not believe that values should be taken under consideration. For democratic nations, it is a fundamental issue. And I would like to say that very often politicians are simply ignoring, considering that it is offered for the public opinion, but in fact, decisive are two first elements, power and interest. I would say the emerging new system will reflect thinking in categories of models which have to be not necessarily logical, not always consistent, and definitely not elegant, but for the European and global order, Yalta is definitely not a pattern, because for the 21st century, these three factors I mentioned should be decisive. In other words, I would like to say that axiology matters, and it cannot be ignored. I will stop here with an intention to respond to the questions if there are some questions. I would be grateful if they are addressed to me in English. Thank you very much.